and presents events that educate and celebrate the people and events that made Concord the center of American independence and imagination. And it is a very special pleasure to welcome Jayne Gordon back to Concord, if only virtually this evening. For nearly 50 years, Jayne worked with Concord historical organizations as an educator, an administrator, consultant, a board member. For many years, she taught the course that turned Concord history into a second career for me. I teach that course now, and let me tell you, Jayne, it's a hard act to follow. She has moved. Now she lives in Damariscotta, Maine, where she continues to teach classes and facilitate programs. Now, like many of you, or some of you, I was very familiar with Henry David Thoreau, but I didn't really know the story of William Brewster until I heard Jayne give a lecture about him a few years ago. And it turns out that these two naturalists have a lot more in common than just a Concord address, as Jayne will show us this evening. There will be a Q&A at the end of the program, and this is in webinar format, so we aren't going to be able to hear you talk. But what I would like you to do is to use the chat feature if you have any questions or thoughts that you want to share, put them in the chat, and we'll give them to Jayne at the end of the regular part of the talk. So please join me in welcoming Jayne Gordon.
Thanks, Victor, and it's great to be back. And I know the Concord History course is in very, very good hands, which makes me feel wonderful. As Victor said, I've been working in Concord history for about 50 years, no exaggeration. And actually 25 years ago exactly, in 1997, when I was working as the director of education at the Concord Museum, I gave a talk on William Brewster because it was the 100th anniversary of Mass Audubon Society. And this was a collaborative effort between the museum and Mass Audubon. And that talk at that time was really introducing people to a man that most of us didn't know very much about. And then I gave another talk just 4 years ago, again at the Concord Museum. And this time I was emphasizing not only Brewster, but how much had changed in terms of our access to him, both our physical access to the places that he trod and our intellectual access to him, because so much more was available to find out about him. And now back again with the Transcendentalism Council. And once again, the Concord Museum has come together with Mass Audubon, as I think most of you know, to put together an exhibition on the time that William Brewster spent in Concord. And that exhibition has opened and it continues, I believe, through September 5th. And this time, again, it's celebrating something very new, which is the gifting of a very large parcel of land on the site of the former October Farm for Mass Audubon to have and develop programming and trails and access to the public. So the exhibition at the Concord Museum, which I would heartily recommend you visit, they always do a wonderful job on those exhibitions, is called Alive with Birds, William Brewster in Concord. And I have not yet seen it, but I've seen the exhibit list.
If I can jump in for just a minute, I would like to let everyone know that I have placed a link in the chat thread to the Concord Museum's page describing that exhibit.
That's excellent. Thank you for doing that. And Brewsters Woods, which encompasses the property that was so important to Brewster. It's a 130-acre property along the banks of the Concord River, and it now forms part of a very large, almost contiguous conservation area that includes the October Farm riverfront property that's jointly managed by the town of Concord and the Concord Land Conservation Trust. And of course, the Great Meadows National Wildlife Refuge and Esterbrook Woods. So you can definitely do so much more in terms of going to the places that Brewster loved. When I gave that talk back in 1997, I had to say to people, well, you can go to Great Meadows, you can walk to the end of the dike, and then kind of look downriver, you know, as far as you can see, and that's where Brewster lived. So now much better access. And because so many of his works, his journals, his writings have been digitized, they're all part of the special collections at the Museum of Comparative Zoology, the Ernest Mayr Library there at the MCZ. You have access that we didn't have, you know, those many years ago. And so those have been made very, very much available. And I would also say one of my favorite things ever is the series of trail guides and trail booklets done by the Town of Concord, the Department of Natural Resources. They're right up on the town website. They are absolutely wonderful, and I use them all the time, both for my own walking and teaching. So heartily recommend that. And there is the trail guide to the October Farm riverfront property right there. So a lot of access. And I would make the point that if William Brewster had lived in a different town, we'd probably be celebrating him a lot more than we have in the past. And maybe his time is coming now. But of course, because he lived in Concord, he tended to get overshadowed by so many of the other luminaries. But we're understanding so much more about him now. And the other thing I would mention to you all is if you go on Mass Audubon's website, they've got recordings of the lecture series that they did last fall that talks about different aspects of Brewster's time in Concord as well. So you've got access to those lovely recordings. What I want to do in this particular talk today is a couple of things. I want to just kind of give you a little bit of an overview of Brewster, assuming most of you know more about Henry Thoreau than you do about William Brewster. I want to also spend some time looking at the similarities, as Victor mentioned, between Brewster's methods and approaches and Thoreau's, but also the differences. And I want to use the rivers, the way they describe the rivers as kind of an example. And then I want to use that to dig a little bit deeper and to really look at Thoreau and how he was different from Brewster or vice versa, because I think we can use Brewster in a way to help us more to understand where Thoreau's coming from. It just sheds a kind of a new illumination, at least for me, on Henry Thoreau by seeing him in contrast to William Brewster. And then I think going back to the end, since this is being sponsored by the Transcendentalist Council, looking at what it means to be a scientist like Thoreau, but also a transcendentalist. And I think Brewster, again, that comparison can help us to understand that. So back to William Brewster for a moment. His dates are 1851 to 1919. Born in Wakefield, Mass, moved to Cambridge when he was little. He, in 1873, he actually became a founding member of the Nuttall Ornithological Club in Cambridge, which is still going, named for Thomas Nuttall, the Harvard professor of natural history, who wrote a manual for US and Canada birds in the 1830s, very popular manual. Serious study of birds, putting in place a system for classification of the birds. It only had 20 members at that point, but they were corresponding all over the world with other ornithologists. Brewster himself did not go to college. He had terrible eyesight, which really handicapped his reading ability. So he didn't do that. He actually did become the curator of birds and mammals for the Boston Society of Natural History. And so his kind of hobby that he had as a child became his vocation. He tried working in his dad's bank, and that did not work well. So not a good match. A decade later, in 1883, William Brewster forms with others the American Ornithologists Union, which is still going strong. The Nuttall Club really spearheaded the formation of that. Brewster's one of the founders. The committees that were created for the AOU were committees on classification and nomenclature and migration, distribution, anatomy, problem invaders like the English sparrows and starlings. And at Brewster's urging, bird protection, not just classification, not just taking the Linnaean system and classifying the birds, but protecting them. So he became the chairman of the committee for the protection of North American birds. He introduced evidence of the slaughter of shorebirds in the plume wars, decorating women's hats, the destruction of colonies of egrets, herons, gulls, terns, cormorants, cranes, pelicans, spoonbills, sandpipers, ibises. The climate at the time, I think we have to understand, was one where birds were used for fashion to decorate hats. And boys did hunting, particularly, I mean, adult men hunted, boys hunted too. They did collecting, they did taxidermy. Edward Jarvis, in his Traditions and Reminiscences of Concord, talks about on election day, a holiday, one of the things that happened is the boys would be formed into teams, and they would go and hunt down as many birds and shoot them as they could. They would bring them back, they would rob as many nests, they would collect the eggs, and the team that got the most in their collection was the winner. So that was a part of kind of everyday life. So it's important, I think, for us to understand that. Brewster's shot heard around the world, which I guess is a bad term to use for this, but in the area of wildlife conservation, under his initial direction, the AOU really began to develop a whole series of model laws, eventually adopted by most of the state legislatures. They defined the game birds that could be hunted under controlled circumstances, the idea of setting hunting seasons and bag limits. They protected all the other species except the English sparrows, the invaders. They forbid the destruction of nests and eggs except for the English sparrows. And they certified scientists to take specimens, they could shoot to collect specimens, but it was a certification process. George Frisbee Hoare, our senator from Massachusetts, actually played a big role in that. The American Ornithological Union could write templates for legislation, but this organization really needed to work with other organizations in the areas of advocacy and public education and government and involvement with bird study and protection. And in the latter, the AOU was instrumental in the creation of the Biological Survey under the U.S. Department of Agriculture, later to become U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service under the Department of the Interior. So the efforts in this area would lead to the hiring of game wardens and the establishment of sanctuaries. The public outreach work of these professional ornithologists, like Brewster, was conducted through the establishment at the very end of the century of the state Audubon societies. And Massachusetts was the first in 1896. And the person who made that happen was not a scientist like Brewster or a legislator like George Frisbee Hoare, but of course, a woman who got mad. And don't ever cross a woman who gets mad. You all know that. She had the power and the connections to make things happen. Her name was Harriet Hemingway. She worked with her friend Minna Hall. They were disgusted at the way that women's hats just decimated bird populations simply for decorative feathers. So she turns to William Brewster to become the first president of Mass Audubon Society. And she has the dream board, Charles Francis Adams, the historian, Bradford Torrey, a nature writer, Henry Higginson, who started the Boston Symphony Orchestra, Sarah Orne Jewett, the writer, Elizabeth Cary Agassiz, the president of Radcliffe, Julia Irvine, president of Wellesley, George Frisbee Hoare himself, and a very good allotment of Cabots and Lowells and Cod and God, and all the Boston Brahmin establishment. So Brewster worked almost 40 years as the founder of the Nuttall Ornithological Society, the AOU, the first president of Mass Audubon, the president of Mass Fish and Game Commission. So he's really combining scientific study with conservation activism. He becomes more and more interested in describing the behavior of birds in their natural habitat instead of just collecting specimens. So that's an important thing to really to understand. He is from 1885 on the curator of the bird collections at the Museum of Comparative Zoology. He's a fellow in the American Society for the Advancement of Science. His own collections would come to the MCZ and are still there. So well-established person. So the question is, why does he come to Concord? You know, it's Thoreau's backyard, but you know, there's not there. You know, you have to dismiss from your minds wonderful meetings between these two men who were so interested in the study of birds, because Brewster was only 11 years old when Henry Thoreau died. When he came, he began coming to Concord in the period after the Civil War, in the late 1860s, and he's familiar with Thoreau's work. He has occasional allusions to it, things that Thoreau wrote in his own journals. But as we'll see, these men were really quite different. They're certainly both interested in the relationship of birds and all creatures to their habitats. They like studying them in the wild, and they both use Concord as an observatory. The differences we're going to discuss later, but you know, they're also very patient. They have great attention to detail, careful record keeping. Their field methodologies were really excellent. But the person who really is the connection for Brewster and Concord is Daniel Chester French, the sculptor. They grew up, the French connection, right? They grew up together in Cambridge. They met when Brewster was 10 and French was 11 in 1861 over a game of marbles, playing right on the street, on Brattle Street, right in Cambridge, right kind of in Longfellow's backyard. One of their good friends would become Longfellow's son-in-law, Richard Henry Dana. They hunted together, they fished together, they skated together, they swam. They both collected eggs and nests and shot and stuffed birds, just like most boys did. William Brewster had his dad's Audubon ornithology, and Dan French had his father's copy of Nuttall's ornithology. So they really, you know, they had that shared interest. The Frenches moved to Concord from Cambridge in the late 1860s. So Brewster visited back and forth. In fact, so one of the most special times that William Brewster shared with Daniel French was their annual trip where they go on the Concord River at least once a year. And it didn't matter what the weather was there. You know, when you read the passages in Brewster's journal, miserable weather, but they're going to do it. That was something that was very important. And they always use that boathouse in back of the manse, and often would head upstream on the Sudbury River into Fairhaven Bay. Of course, the first sight that French would see on leaving the manse would be his own Minuteman statue, right? Imagine that as you're leaving the backyard of the manse. In 1882, they make it up to Sherman's Bridge, north of 27, before torrential rain forces them back. And that's one of the ones that is Brewster writes about. 4 years later, French and his, Brewster and his wife decide to take rooms at the manse from April to October, and then they eventually start to get very much interested in coming to Concord themselves, and it'll be a long time until they buy property, but it's really important to understand that lifelong friendship. And they're both interested in the structure of wings. Think about it. Brewster with, in his study of birds, French in the use of wings and so many of the figures in his statue. And when Brewster died, by the way, French actually designed his tombstone and a special medal, and he wrote the introduction to one of the very few published works of Brewster, October Farm. So Brewster starts to buy land in Concord in 1890s. In 1891, the area around Balls Hill, Holden Hill, Davis Hill, to protect a lot of it, to protect the land, protect a stand of trees. They buy a 1740s farmhouse on Monument Street, October Farm, which is still there, about 300 acres in all, where the Concord River takes a very sharp bend north downriver on its way to the confluence with the Merrimack River in Lowell. He moved here, but he spent he spent all but the winters at October Farm, even though even the winters often couldn't keep him away. So he was here until his death, just after the end of World War I, in 1919. So the significance of Concord to Brewster, his lifelong goal was to know everything about birds in their natural habitats. And even though he had one of the largest collections of mounted specimens of North American birds, he needed to observe their behavior in the field, in the wild. So he much preferred field work to lab work. As we said, he's working at the Museum of Comparative Zoology, founded by Louis Agassiz, for whom Thoreau had actually collected specimens. Brewster would eventually leave all his collections to the MCZ, both his written collections and his stuffed collections. But he's not a professor working in Cambridge. Remember, he didn't go to Harvard himself because of his vision impairment. He's literally out in the field every day, making an exhaustive study of bird life. And Concord's the perfect field laboratory for him. Thoreau's already proven that, unlike increasingly urbanized Cambridge, this is a perfect place for study of wildlife. His range was getting more and more focused in terms of where he roamed. And I know Ron McAdow is here, so he knew your rivers really well, Ron. He had spent a lot of time originally up in his camp at Lake Umbagog, which is right on the Maine New Hampshire border, north of Grafton Notch and kind of west of Rangeley. And now he's going to focus almost exclusively on the Concord area, upriver on the Sudbury to Sherman's Bridge, on the Wayland kind of Sudbury line, then downriver to the Carlisle Bridge, where kind of Route 225, and up the Assabet River. And eventually his range would even get narrower as he's focusing his study pretty much from Egg Rock, and I think you all know where that is, at the confluence of the Sudbury and Assabet, to the Carlisle Bridge, but most of the time spent right on his own or near his own property. So October Farm itself, with a mix of upland and wetlands area, it's becoming a wildlife sanctuary, and he puts up no shooting signs. He's beginning to not want to have any of that happening in his property, including he's stopping the shooting of birds himself and collecting. So a lot of the time he spends in kind of Thoreauvian simplicity. He is a man of considerable wealth. He had a lot of assistants, and we'll talk about that, helping him out in caring for the property and cataloging the flora and the fauna. And he would come to build several rustic cabins on his property where he would cook and eat meals. He'd camp out and put up his endless list of guests. Some of the little stone boathouses that he had built, he had cut canals through the grasses at the river's edge to facilitate access to the boat landings. They're still there, as well as a building that served as a barn and a storehouse and foreman's residence that he had built on the property as well. So he's coming to understand things that that you could really only understand by being right there. I want to talk to you about his assistants, because that is, a story that's a really important story, and we'll hit on that in just a second. But just quickly looking at his methods, Ludlow Griscom, who wrote The Birds of Concord in 1949, details Brewster's system from the collections at the MCZ, where he was the curator of ornithology. He spent 13 years analyzing Brewster's data, his enormous data. Brewster had an annual diary, a page a day diary, where he had a catalog of the birds he collected. He had field lists for each day of each trip he took, chronological. He had 40 volumes of journals, observations on weather, habits, songs, life histories, past experience, comparisons. In the 1890s, he went over all his daily records, and he rearranged all the materials so that all the data for each of the species together was all put together for each species. So, the years, the months, days, numbers seen, localities, observers. He had symbols for the nests, the songs, the call notes. He also went over all his field notes from earlier observations from the 60s and 70s, checking for inaccuracies or undocumented statements. So he's absolutely precise and conscientious. Griscom felt he was one of America's great ornithologists. He could recognize birds from a distance, and we'll find out in a minute, it wasn't always just him. He could hear the bird calls and the songs. He had wonderful musical memory. He was a dead shot when he needed to be an expert collector. He needed to ID the structure and plumage. He tried, he actually used a spyglass, but not with great success. And eventually he starts shooting birds with a camera, not with a gun. This becomes enormously important. He's an expert at finding bird nests, and he knew the locality, thoroughly. It's a sad time in a way. He's working in a time of decreasing populations of birds and threats to the woodlands and the rivers. A modern expert has so many more resources to learn from, with guidebooks and equipment and transportation and other experts and area specimen lists, but he did well. Other than materials for recording data and field glasses, which were kind of like opera glasses by the time of the Civil War, the prism binoculars, which would be invented in Germany, just wouldn't be available until after World War I. He had a shotgun because sometimes he, as we said before, had to shoot things in order to see them up close. He talks about a 5x7 camera. Now that the camera, we'll talk about it in a second, he had a stopwatch for timing the bird calls and songs. And by 1910, he actually had a telephone as well. He spent a lot of time on foot, but he had a flotilla of boats, canoes, flatboats. He paddled and he pulled and he rowed and he sailed. His sailing canoe was called the Rushton. It was a Rob Roy style sailing canoe. As we said, he had a boathouse that he used. He used that one at the manse, and then he had that floated down on barrels to Buttrick's Landing, where the boats shared occupancy with a large family of muskrats. And then he had built that stone boat houses on his own property. He often traveled in an open carriage or buggy, but he also would take the train. He actually would take a train out often on the Middlesex Central Railroad. He could take a train to West Bedford, basically right across the river from where he was, and then he would have somebody row him across the river, or he would cross on ice. And sometimes all his canoes and equipment would be transported on the Fitchburg Railroad, and often they could make use by the early 20th century of trolleys as public transportations as well. But he actually bought 7 acres in West Bedford across the river from October Farm. So that's where, that would be where he would get over from. That was usually the easiest way. And sometimes in the winter, a sleigh or a woodshed. And the final day in Concord that he spent, he left in a Ford motor car. So things had changed so much. He worked with professionals and amateurs. And what we now know is that his chief assistant, his right-hand man, was an African-American man named Robert Gilbert. That is a fascinating story in itself. John Hanson Mitchell, who was the editor of Audubon Sanctuary magazine for many, many years, found a trove of glass plate negatives in the attic of the estate in Lincoln that Mass Audubon owned by Drumlin Farm, where John worked. Eventually about 2,000 of them, and William Brewster was credited as the photographer. But there's one particularly intriguing scene taken up at the cabinet camp at Lake Umbagog, this group of very well-dressed Brahmini-looking women and men out in the wilderness. And in the picture, there's a young Black man. And the question is, who is he? What's he doing there? So when John did a book project that he was working on, he went to a publication party, and there's a young man who came up to him, a research assistant at the MCZ, and he tells John, "You got it all wrong. It wasn't Brewster who took all those pictures. It was Gilbert." He had been Brewster's assistant. He had been working at Mass General Hospital, taking care of animals in the labs, and Brewster met him and he just became absolutely an essential partner to William Brewster. He's with him hauling the camera and the tripod, of course, but he's also taking the pictures for Brewster as Brewster's kind of scoping out the settings. Brewster had one of those cabins on his property built for Robert Gilbert, so he's indispensable, and there's a whole part of the exhibit at the museum about him. The book that John wrote is called "Looking for Mr. Gilbert," and it's really quite an interesting romp and read. So I'd heartily recommend it. Again, by John Hanson Mitchell. And Brewster, when he was very elderly, wanted to make sure that Gilbert would always have work. So he got him a job at the MCZ as a curatorial assistant. Wanted to make sure that he was well provided for. He also, William Brewster worked with a lot of people who were first-rate ornithologists and scientists and nature writers. Bradford Torrey, who in 1906 would co-edit Thoreau's journal, if that name sounds familiar. Frank Bowles, who was the secretary of Harvard, who would take a canoe trip with Brewster. Then people like Ernest Thomas Seton, who was an artist and naturalist and story writer. Frank Chapman, who was the curator of birds at the American Museum of Natural History. Edward Howe Forbush, who was the state ornithologist, and he had all his buddies in the Nuttall Club, and then he had friends and neighbors who became his eyes as well, kind of like citizen science projects that we talk about today. Marion Keyes, who lived on Liberty Street, and Reginald Heber Howe, who was a teacher at the Middlesex School. Edward Emerson, Ralph Waldo Emerson's son, and Reverend Smith Owen Dexter of Trinity Episcopal Church, who would eventually select the excerpts from Brewster's journals so that they could be published as October Farm, and Stedman Buttrick, who lived on the hill overlooking the North Bridge. So a very large, when you look at his journal entries, he often talking about Miss Marion Keyes and Miss Bartlett saw a painted tortoise, and their observations, and then they bring it to him and his observations. So he's really trained his neighbors well. So why isn't he better known? He didn't publish. According to Griscom, he was always in the field, always trying to integrate more data into a comprehensive system. So he didn't get it out there and published. He was a perfectionist. He's always erasing and revising. French said he always wanted to publish natural history articles in popular journals, but he just anguished over each word. He spent one afternoon perfecting one single sentence. So he really had impossibly high standards. He did have 4 publishing projects, only the first one of which he ever completed: The Birds of the Cambridge region, The Birds of Lake Umbagog region, The Birds of Concord, the last 15 volumes of his journal are almost exclusively between Concord and Carlisle, and the birds of Massachusetts and New England. 50 binders, but they never got published. And selections from his journals were published, but they were published after his death in 2 volumes, which some of you may own. October Farm in 1936, and that was by Reverend Dexter of Trinity Episcopal, with the introduction by Daniel Chester French. And then Concord River, that was published the next year by Thomas Barber of the MCZ. He easily could have written 20, they could have published 20 more volumes, never repeating the same passages twice. So he very much was a wonderful writer, as you'll see, and he combines very beautiful prose with scientific investigation and very, very clear, compelling style. So the question is, and we want to go back to this, I'm just mindful of our time here. How is this approach different from Thoreau's? They both studied wildlife in the context of the environment. They're not interested in describing things in a vacuum. They're very much interested in the ecological relationships among living things. They both interpret their findings, but for Thoreau, the philosopher, the symbolic meaning of what he observes, the meaning for him is key. His life, his love of nature has a spiritual quality, and his relationship to the rest of the natural world is his pursuit. And I want to go back to that in a second. For Brewster, the scientist, the investigation of wildlife is aimed at a more thorough understanding of the subjects, not a thorough understanding of William Brewster himself. So William Brewster is not interested in studying William Brewster and his relationship to the rest of the living world. He's interested in studying the rest of the living world. So in the words of Dr. Barber from the MCZ, Brewster was not a crusader. For him, the point was what he had seen, not what he thought about it. For Thoreau, and this is a similarity, the killing of birds for scientific study became increasingly troublesome. He said he wrote in his journal, in Boston yesterday, an ornithologist said to me, if you held the bird in your hand, and I said, I would rather hold it in my affections. So that's quite a difference. Brewster eventually kind of follows that path. He decides he'd really rather study behavior of these specimens and leave off the killing of the specimens in order to study the structure. He's more interested in the actual behavior. Now, this really gets me to the point of looking at how their contrasting approaches play out. And we could do this probably with any kind of thing, but particularly with the river. I love to look at the rivers and how they both treat the rivers. So I want to read you just a passage from Brewster. I could have taken one of many, but this one really I loved, because it was also written on my birthday, but it was written 130 years ago, June 21st. And you could get a sense just of his writing style. 5 p.m., Lee Davis's Hill, sitting in my canoe, writing these lines in the shade, the sun having sunk behind the tops of the pines to the west. Great sulphurous white clouds floating in a pale blue sky, the foliage of the white maples along the river and the edges of the meadow tossing in the wind, looking thin and disheveled and showing the whitish undersurfaces of the leaves. About the canoe, the water is covered thickly with the floating leaves of the pond lily, and he writes about other things that he sees on the river. Behind and above the lower wall of diversified but generally tender green foliage rise the somber pines and tall old oaks for which the hill is famous. A pine warbler is singing in the pines, a veery, catbird, chestnut-sided warbler, and Maryland yellowthroat in the thickets near the water. From across the river comes the rich gurgly and purly of the redwing, and further off rises the tinkling melody of the bobolink. Now I hear a robin singing, and next a grosbeak. A wood pewee gives a low, sad pee among the pines. Now a black-billed cuckoo in the extreme distance, and a song sparrow near at hand. The fine bass voice bass voice of the bullfrog rolls out over the water from his ready covert at frequent intervals, and the green frog answers with a tung tung on his own tight harp strings. So beautiful writing. And that's, an example of many, many, many. When we look at Thoreau writing about the river, he has the same kind of close observation and beautiful prose, but there's a difference. And I once gave a talk on all the different ways that Thoreau saw a river, and just, it just really impressed on me at that time how many ways that he related to the river. As Thoreau said, I was born upon the river, thy river bank, that my blood flows in thy stream, and thou meanders forever at the bottom of my dream. So Thoreau is looking and surveying, as he put it, the river in so many ways. But one of the ways that he's doing this is he's looking at the effect on him. He's looking at the effect of the river on just his moods and his feelings. And he talks about just how the different contrasting geology of the land around the Sudbury and Assipet River results in the differences not only in the flow of the rivers and in the different economic social histories, but in just the way they make you feel. We are favored in having two rivers flowing into one, says Thoreau, whose banks afford different kinds of scenery, the streams being of different characters. And so that, over and over again, you see that where the river is being used. He uses the river as a kind of a vantage point, and his geographical vantage point equals his kind of intellectual vantage point. In other words, his physical point of view really is a reflection of his thinking point of view. He's seeing things in different ways depending on where he is. Sometimes he's on the river in a boat, sometimes he's actually in the river up to his neck in the water. And he just has a wonderful way of looking at the river and the properties of a river. He talks about the currents of the river, the flow of the river, and the flow of your thoughts. And so he's always seeing that correspondence between the kind of the nature out there and human nature. That's hugely important. So let me just give you an example of that for a second. He says, I think, and he wrote in his journal in 1852, I think our overflowing river, far handsomer and more abounding in soft and beautiful contrasts than a merely broad river would be, a succession of bays it is, a chain of lakes, an endlessly scalloped shore, rounding wood and field, cultivated field and wood and pasture and house, are brought into ever new and unexpected positions and relations to the water. There is just stream enough for a flow of thought. That is all. So again, that echoing, that reflecting of the river, reflecting his own moods, reflecting his own thoughts. And that, I think, is a huge contrast with Brewster, who will not do that. Wanted to just give you a couple more examples of that, and then deep down look into why that is, what that tells us about Thoreau. He uses Thoreau does the properties of a river to really as a metaphor for the characteristics of man. He's using nature to examine human nature. He says the life in us is like the water in a river. He says that in Walden. And he talks about the fact that rivers are different than any other feature of the landscape. They move, they flow, they change the banks around them. They create new channels. They cut right through the middle of places that seem to stand still with their own rush of energy at times. And in times they're very placid. And so that these are all things that also are properties of human personalities as well. He says a man's life should be constantly as fresh as the river. It should be the same channel, but a new water every instant. So again, that reflection of the human spirit in the river. Rivers flow from pure sources to the sea, just as human lives flow from birth to death. They They never stop. They're always being replenished and refreshed and revitalized, reinvigorated. And Thoreau talks a lot about that, those kinds of river properties. He talks about, and so it is interesting. And let me read you this from his journal on August 31st, 1851. How rich, like we love to read of South American primitive forests, is the scenery of this river. What luxuriance of weeds, what depth of mud along its sides. These old anti-historic, geologic, antediluvian rocks, which only primitive wading birds still lingering among us are worthy to tread. The season which we seem to live in anticipation of is arrived. The water indeed reflects heaven because my mind does. Such is its own serenity, its transparency and stillness. With what sober joy I stand to let the water drip from me and feel my fresh vigor, who have been bathing in the same tub in which the muskrat uses. Such a medicated bath as only nature furnishes. A fish leaps and the dimple he makes is observed now. And he goes on in that way, over and over again, reflecting on the properties of the river. So he's really using it as a metaphor, as a symbol. There's something in the scenery of a broad river equivalent to culture and civilization. Its channel conducts our thoughts as well as bodies to classic and famous ports and allies us to all that is fair and great. I like to remember that at the end of half a day's walk, I can stand on the bank of the Merrimack. It is just wide enough to interrupt the land and lead my eye and thoughts down its channel to the sea. A river is superior to a lake in its liberating influence. It has motion and infinite length. A river touching the back of a town is like a wing. It may be unused as yet, but ready to waft it over the world. With its rapid current, it is a slightly fluttering wing. River towns are winged towns. So you can see that Thoreau's, writing the kind of thing, you're just not, you have to believe me, you're not seeing that kind of writing in William Brewster's observations. And so it really gets into the whole question. And I want to sort of spend the remaining time that I have on this question, which is how, why is Thoreau seeing things so differently? And I'm beginning to more and more realize that over these years of looking at Thoreau, there were a lot of things that I think I understood, but there are also a lot of things that I didn't understand as well. And part of that was the influence of Alexander von Humboldt on Thoreau. Humboldt really is the scientist, and again, he's a generation older than Thoreau, although sadly he only died 3 years before Thoreau did. A great German scientist and philosopher, geographer, explorer. His best friend, Humboldt's best friend, was Goethe, the philosopher Goethe. And so Humboldt is the one who really combines science and poetry, the intellect and the imagination. And when Thoreau reads Humboldt, he realizes that he can be both a poet and a scientist and a naturalist at the same time, that those things are not mutually exclusive. And what's fascinating to do, and I'm just going to do a little bit of it here, is to look at the journal passages that Thoreau writes, particularly between the time that he leaves Walden in 1847, and he goes through all those different iterations, drafts of the book Walden, which won't be published until August of 1854. During that time, he's really grappling with his descriptions of what's around him. And he's going back and forth between that sort of scientific observation and then just the more free flow of poetry. And it's fascinating to see how he is beginning to sort of define his relationship with the natural world. I'm going to read just a few of these are very quick little excerpts, and I actually am being very lazy because so many of these were compiled in a larger book called Material Faith, Henry David Thoreau on Science, and they were compiled actually with an introduction by the late E.O. Wilson. They were compiled by Laura Dessau Walls, who wrote, of course, the magnificent biography of Thoreau in 2017 for his bicentennial, but who also had written Cosmos about Humboldt and Seeing New Worlds about Thoreau's relationship to science. So these are some of the things that she used in her own books, but they really give us such a picture, again, of what Thoreau's grappling with. So he says, Thoreau actually says, this habit of close observation in Humboldt and Darwin and others, he says, poetry puts an interval between the impression and the expression, waits till the seed germinates naturally. So when you're receiving those impressions, there's that part, the input, but then the output is going to mix with something within you to come, to yield something very, very different. And again, so there's that one. He says, what a poor dry compilation is the annual of scientific discovery. I trust that observations are being made. He's talking about a report he's received. I trust that observations are being made during the year, which are not chronicled there, that some mortal may have caught a glimpse of nature in some corner of the earth during the year 1851. One sentence of poetry would make me forget, would atone for volumes of mere science. He says, the question is not what you look at, but how you look and whether you see. And then in the very next week, he writes, I fear that the character of my knowledge is from year to year becoming more distinct and scientific, that in exchange for views as wide as heaven's cope, I am being narrowed down to the field of the microscope. I see details, not wholes, nor the shadow of the whole. I count some parts and I say, I know. So he's realizing that in that sort of segregated focus on the detail, he's missing the whole, he's missing the connections, the whole thing. He says it's the marriage of the soul with nature that makes the intellect fruitful, that gives birth to imagination. That's one of my favorites. And then this one from his journal in 1852, February, I suspect that the child plucks its first flower with an insight into its beauty and significance, which the subsequent botanist never retains. He says, I have a common, and he talks about the fact that he has a commonplace book, sort of where he records things, one for facts and another one for poetry. And he's beginning to realize that he really should have just one book that integrates them both. He says, I should need but one book of poetry to contain them all, because as he says later, a fact will flower into a truth. That segregation into disciplines of knowledge, and that, making that division between art and science or literature and science is something that he is really resisting. And this is all written again in that time period where he's working on all the drafts of Walden. So you can just see this, entering into his thinking. He says, facts collected by a poet are set down at last as winged seeds of truth. Facts fall from the poetic observer as ripe seeds. And then just a couple of more here. He is the richest who has the most use for nature as raw material of tropes and symbols with which to describe his life. If these gates of golden willows affect me, they correspond to the beauty and promise of some experience on which I am entering. If I am overflowing with life, am rich in experience for which I lack expression, then nature will be my language full of poetry. All nature will fable, and every natural phenomenon will be a myth. The man of science who is not seeking for expression, but for a fact to be expressed merely, studies nature as a dead language. I pray for such inward experience as will make nature significant. And then I think many of you are familiar with this, but he talks about the fact that the secretary for the Association of the Advancement of Science requests me, Thoreau says, as he probably has thousands of others, by a printed circular letter from Washington the other day, to fill in the blanks against certain questions, among which the most important one was, what branch of science was I particularly interested in? Using the term science in the most comprehensive sense possible. Now, though I could state to a select few that department of human inquiry which engages me and should be rejoiced at an opportunity to do so, I felt that it would be to make myself the laughing stock of the scientific community, to describe or attempt to describe to them that branch of science which especially interests me, inasmuch as they do not believe in a science which deals with the higher law. So I was obliged to speak to their condition and describe to them that poor part of me which alone they can understand. And here's the quote I know you all know. The fact is that I am a mystic, a transcendentalist, and a natural philosopher to boot. Now I think of it, I should have told them at once that I was a transcendentalist. That would have been the shortest way of telling them that they would not understand my explanations. How absurd that though I probably stand as near to nature as any of them, and am by constitution as good an observer as most, yet a true account of my relationship to nature should excite their ridicule only. If it had been the secretary of an association of which Plato or Aristotle was the president, I should not have hesitated to describe my studies at once and particularly. So, you know, when he can't be categorized himself, he cannot be made to determine exactly what it is that he is doing that fits into the model of what scientists do. He says, is it not language that all natural objects affect the poet? He sees a flower or other object and it is beautiful or affecting to him because it is a symbol of his thought. And what he indistinctly feels or perceives is matured in some other organization. The objects I behold correspond to my mood. So he fills out the questionnaire and he declines the offer to be made a member of the American Academy for the Advancement of Science. Name, Henry David Thoreau. Occupation, literary and scientific combined with land surveying. Post office address, Henry D. Thoreau, Concord, Mass. Branches of science in which a special interest is felt, the manners and customs of the Indians of the Algonquin group previous to contact with the civilized man. Why the interest in Native Americans? Why that enormous amount of time spent studying and filling notebooks with observations started when he took the 3 trips to Maine. It's because he felt that Native Americans had an understanding of nature and a way of relating to nature that the scientists just didn't have, that they were much more intimately acquainted with nature. And they had a language that described their own relationship to the rest of the natural world. And so that's enormously important to him. He says basically about the Native Americans that they're much more alive and their knowledge is much more a part of what interests him. And if you've read Braiding Sweetgrass, I think you know Robin Wall Kimmerer's wonderful book, you'll know exactly why that echoes. But on Thoreau's remarks on this little questionnaire, he says, I may add that I am an observer of nature generally, and the character of my observations, so far as they are scientific, may be inferred from the fact that I am especially attracted by such books of science as White's Selborne and Humboldt's Aspects of Nature. Again, the Humboldt, we explained, Aspects of Nature looked at the unification of science, nature, art, everything, all one big unifying connected whole. And Selborne is Gilbert White's study of one place, of his native town of Selborne in England, which again, enormously important to Thoreau. So to finish up on that, he says the inhumanity of science concerns me, as when I am tempted to kill a rare snake that I may ascertain its species. I feel that this is not the way of acquiring true knowledge. And he talks about that also with a box turtle. These were things that he had to send in as specimens because he was doing some field biology for Louis Agassiz at the MCZ. He also says, and this is kind of a direct, this would be something that William Brewster probably would not have appreciated. He says, I've just been looking at Nuttall's North American Silva. Much research, fine plates and print and paper, But he says, there's no life in it. He says the plates are greener and higher colored than the words. It is sapless, if not leafless. So there, I think you see that contrast. And then finally, as he says, again, so many times I'm reminded of the advantage to the poet and philosopher and naturalist and whomsoever of pursuing from time to time some other business than his chosen one, seeing with the side of the eye. The poet will get visions which no deliberate abandonment can secure. The philosopher is so forced to recognize principles which long study might not detect. And the naturalist will even stumble upon some new and expected flower or animal. The integration of all these different ways of seeing, not the segmentation of them, hugely important to Thoreau. He says, I think the man of science makes this mistake, and the mass of mankind along with him, that you should coolly give your chief attention to the phenomenon which excites you as something independent of you and not as it is related to you. The important fact is its effect on me. With regard to such objects, I find that it is not they themselves with which men of science deal that concern me. The point of interest is somewhere between me and them, that interrelationship. No science does more than arrange what knowledge we have of any class of objects, but generally speaking, the Native American, has the closest to wild nature of anyone, as I already mentioned. And then the final one here, which I think kind of really sums it up here. It's only when we forget all our learning that we begin to know. I do not get nearer by a hair's breadth to any natural object so long as I presume that I have an introduction to it from a learned man. To conceive of it with a total apprehension, I must for the 1000th time approach it as something totally strange. If you would make acquaintance with the ferns, you must forget your botany. You must get rid of what is commonly called knowledge of them. Not a single scientific term or distinction is the least to the purpose, for you would fain perceive something, and you must approach the object totally unprejudiced. You must be aware that no thing is what you have taken it to be. In what book is this world and the beauty described? Who has plotted the steps toward the discovery of beauty? Same thing that Robin Kimmerer asked. You have got to be in a different state from the common. Your greatest success will be simply to perceive that such things are, and you will have no communication to make to the Royal Society of Scientists. So just to quickly sum that up. So with Brewster, you've got a man who's an observer, a describer, a recorder of nature outside of himself. He's objective, he's methodical, he's concerned about other species, he's concerned about loss of habitat, he's concerned about protecting other species, but he's apart from them. He's looking at them from a vantage point of being apart from them. He's not part of them. Thoreau is also recording all those same things, but he's recording his own behaviors as well and his own feelings, because for him, the study of nature is not just a study of external world, it's a study of his internal world. It's both, it's the external and it's the internal. It's his subjective world, it's his feelings, it's the combination of his intellect and imagination. So truth for him is not just through an assembled empirical evidence, a collection of evidence, but it's also through his own inner light, his soul. So he's combining his poetry. He's combining that with his field work. He's combining scientific discovery and self-discovery. He doesn't feel that he's separate from the natural world that he and Brewster had so carefully and methodically documented. He's part and parcel, as he says, of that world. He's trying to understand his relationship to it all as one unified whole. And it sounds on the surface that maybe he's self-absorbed, but if you think about it, he's not. He's just trying to understand as one living thing his relationship to the entire web of life. And as I think we know, knowledge comes in many ways. It comes from being in tune and in harmony with nature, because we're an integral part of this living miraculous world, according to Thoreau. We're living in nature. We're not just merely studying it. We are nature. So as Thoreau himself described it, and as I will say to you, as you know, as visitors to the Transcendentalism and the Transcendentalist Council, Thoreau was definitely a Transcendentalist. So thank you.
Thank you, Jayne. I was kind of very interested in the way you described Thoreau's kind of holistic, intuitive approach, and contrasted it with Brewster's more, dare I say, academic approach, because of course Thoreau actually went to Harvard, and Brewster didn't go to college at all, and I was fascinated by what you said about, Brewster didn't go to college because his eyesight wasn't good enough. And then he went on to become this incredibly precise identifier of an observer of different species, a crack shot with a gun, prolific writer. And I'm wondering if it really was his eyesight that was bothering him, or if he just didn't want that wasn't the world he wanted to be in, and that he didn't want to waste his time being educated to live in that world in his parents.
Yeah, it's a very good question, and I don't know the answer. There may be people here who do. He might, and again, as you said, he's a precise, methodical observer. Now, Thoreau actually was also a precise, methodical observer and could be very academically inclined if he wanted to be. He just is rejecting, that being the only part of his way of knowing things, right? Thoreau is making that choice to reject that aspect of it. And again, as we're finding out, a lot of the things that we attributed to Brewster may have actually been physically done by Gilbert, Robert Gilbert, and other people. That's one of the things we're coming to understand, that, for example, Brewster didn't take all those photographs. Gilbert did a large majority of them. I mean, under the direction of William Brewster, but he may not have physically performed all the feats that we credit him with performing, which is not taking away from him at all. And again, as you see, Brewster was a beautiful writer. I came late to reading Concord River and October Farm, the two published versions, but they're absolutely lovely. And but he's not in it to talk about how it makes him feel. He's in it to really document the habitat and the loss of habitat of the species of birds.
Tammy Rose noted in the comments that she actually found John Hanson Mitchell's book about Gilbert.
Yeah.
At Barrow Bookshop, of course. Yay, Barrow Bookshop.
Hey, excellent.
And there's a question, thanking you for bringing together Thoreau's kind of unifying art and science in his approach. And is there a program happening now with youth education that brings together STEAM and philosophy, STEAM, science, technology, engineering, arts, and math? So that's the question.
I don't know, but I bet there are people here who could answer. I'm sure. I mean, and I think Muir follows very much in that. If you read My First Summer in the Sierras, and he says, "I'm in the mountains, and the mountains are in me." That again, resisting that artificial distinction and integrating things together, much more important. I know that. I mean, here in Maine, a lot of our local conservation organizations have summer camps, and it's looking at all the different ways of surveying the environment and relating to the environment. It's not segmenting, into disciplines that don't cross over and connect with each other.
Of course, there's the Rivers and Revolutions
Yeah,
program at Concord
Michael
Carlisle
Good.
High School that I think is very much in this vein. But
Absolutely.
here's another question that was just asked. Are you making a distinction between one who gathers knowledge versus one who knows?
Ooh, that's interesting. And that was Jim's, right?
That's Jim, yeah.
Okay.
Very transcendent.
A distinction between one who gathers information and one who knows. Yeah, I mean, that is interesting because the knowing, and again, I mean, we could go back and we could look at, Immanuel Kant, and we could look at, Goethe, we could look at the Romantic poets, we could look at that whole thing between the senses and, reason and intuition, and, what you learn just through gathering things through empirical evidence and what you know intuitively, that inner light. And I guess I would say right off the cuff, although this is something that really bears a lot of really deeper thought, is that both Thoreau and Brewster were gatherers of knowledge, and Brewster's way of knowing, was very, kind of academic, but knowing, in order to help, in order to protect. Whereas Thoreau is very much open to different ways of knowing, and I think that's why he has that fascination with Native Americans. And some of that might have been a little sophomoric kind of, noble savage thing, but he sincerely interested, if you just look at the extent to which he went to understand Native Americans and their ways of knowing and being part of a living whole, that's something that absolutely fascinates him.
Okay, thank you, Jayne. So that's all the questions we've got, and I just want to thank you so much for sharing your time and your insights with us, making a virtual visit back to Concord. And I also want to thank all of you who tuned in to listen to Jayne this evening, and I hope you will join us for the Transcendentals and Council's next program, which is going to be a presentation by Mark Gallagher from the Thoreau Society. He's a Thoreau scholar, and that's going to be on April 23rd. We will be emailing everyone who is registered for this with the details of that event. So wait a minute, here's another question. Did Brewster ever call himself a transcendentalist?
I doubt it. I don't think he would have considered himself a transcendentalist. No,
all right. Well, thank you all, and have a wonderful spring evening, and hope to see you all again real soon.
It's great to see everybody. Bye-bye.